Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ingrid Gerstmann, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome everyone to our experts panel, COVID-19 and Geopolitics, the pandemic's impact on global relations. We have a lot to get through today, so without delay, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Stuart Gottlieb. Stuart is a longtime member of the Saltzman Institute, and he's been teaching here at SIPA since 2003, including his award-winning course on American foreign policy. He will guide us through today's event. So please, Stuart, take it away.
Thanks, Ingrid. I know people are still jumping in, but we wanted to get started. We're all really happy to be here today, and we have an exceptional panel with us, I'm pleased to say. Jeffrey Sachs, longtime professor here at Columbia and director of Columbia's Center for Sustainable Development, who has written and spoken widely on many of the issues before us today. Danielle Pletka, a U.S. foreign policy expert from the American Enterprise Institute, who should look familiar to anyone who regularly watches NBC's Meet the Press, among other things. And Andrew Scobell from RAND, one of the world's foremost experts on Chinese foreign politics and foreign policy, as well as its ambitions in the world, and also a fellow Columbia PhD, I should add. So really a perfect mix of intellectual and policy expertise with us today. Unfortunately, I should say Jeff Sachs is going to need to jump around 12:30, so he's going to be our first speaker in just a minute. But allow me to briefly set up today's topic before I turn it over to Jeff. It was exactly 1 year ago this week that professors like Jeff Sachs and me were informed that Columbia was shutting everything down due to this new highly infectious virus known as COVID-19, and that all of our classes were going fully remote after spring break. For most of us, they still are. An extremely difficult and tragic year has now gone by, and we thought it would be a good time to look beyond the obvious impacts that the COVID pandemic has had on lives and livelihoods and major sectors of economies throughout the world, and begin making some sense of what this global pandemic, the worst in a century, might mean for global relations and world politics generally now and into the future. If there's one thing we know from studying international affairs, it's that the world has a way of throwing major curveballs at you from time to time. And sometimes those curveballs are so profound and impactful that they shake up the very foundations of the international system and major countries and actors within it. Think Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914, for example. Over the past 3 decades, multiple curveballs have been thrown at world affairs. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, the terror attacks on September 11th, 2001, and America's highly militarized responses, the 2008 global financial crisis that began in the US banking system and then quickly spread to Europe and the rest of the world, these all jump to mind. I should note that the second and third of these, America's ongoing costly war on terror and the global financial crisis, provided the impetus for a rapidly rising China to consider breaking from Deng Xiaoping's famous hide our strength and bide our time approach to foreign policy and begin playing a far more assertive role in global affairs since Xi Jinping assumed the helm as president for life. And consider this, that was all before the pandemic struck. So while saving as many lives as possible around the world in the coming months and years and eventually getting this pandemic behind us is obviously priority number one, we simply cannot ignore the fact that the pandemic outbreak and the varied impacts and responses to it around the world has thrown another major curveball at world affairs, with more than a few countries believing it may help reshuffle the deck of world politics in their favor. Ironically, even though the virus started in China, most likely at an open food market, most countries of the world have been hit much harder than China, particularly Western liberal democracies. There are some surprising statistics there that I want to get to a little bit later. And while China's economy gears itself back to full steam ahead, most of its main economic competitors are still struggling to get their bearings. Here's how Mohamed El-Arian, chief economist for the European financial services giant Allianz, put it yesterday on CNBC about the global economic recovery from the virus. Quote, China is sprinting ahead. The United States is second, and Europe is struggling, unquote. These three entities, the US, China, and the European Union, account for about 55 trillion of the world's 87 trillion in total GDP, or nearly 2/3 of the world's total. So at one global layer, the world's most powerful countries, the US, China, the rest of the P5, the European Union, we know that post-pandemic economic competition will be hot and heavy and hugely consequential. But we also know that even before the pandemic, the 21st century was already shaping up to be not just about economic and military hard power competition between the two most powerful states, the US and China, but it was also shaping up to be a competition over which model of governance, which political system, the China model or the American Western model, was best suited for the challenges of the modern age. These are points I'd like to return to later because I think, to paraphrase Mark Twain, predictions of the death of liberal democracy have been greatly exaggerated. But for now, suffice it to say, the pandemic has shuffled the deck of world affairs, and not just for the so-called great powers, but also for the operations of vital global institutions like the United Nations and the World Health Organization that require friendly collaboration by major countries of the world. And as we know, when these institutions suffer, it will be the poorest nations of the world that get hit the hardest. We're actually witnessing a whole new form of diplomacy in the world right now. Did you know this? There's a whole new global term right now out there in the environs of world politics called vaccine diplomacy. Vaccine diplomacy is a new term out there. And it's not just China, but also countries like India, the UAE, Israel, and others who are trying to fill the voids of Western leadership or lack thereof in global vaccine distribution. These countries are trying to engage in their own soft power efforts to do some good in the world. Or a cynic might say, to gain friends and influence people in important regions of the world. So suffice it to say, there's a lot going on. We're going to try to make some sense of it today together. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and I'll see you a little bit later.
Greetings, colleagues. Stuart, thank you for that fantastic introduction. Really so insightful and such a good base for our discussion. I think if you look at those dates, June 28th, 1914, September 11, 2001, September 14, 2008, December probably 11 is the right date, 1991, all these turning points. What's probably striking is that it wasn't the event of that day which changed the world, but how we responded to those events. And I would say in those cases, in a pretty piss poor way. The assassination of an archduke did not have to lead to the destruction of European civilization. The crimes of September 11 led to a morass of war across the Middle East for 20 years. The failures of Lehman Brothers did not need to lead to a $10 trillion financial catastrophe, but it was mishandled, and so forth. And I think, therefore, what we're talking about mostly is not the inevitability of crises, conflict, chaos, but really the nature of our reactions to challenges and how to avoid the disasters of those episodes that you remind us of. And that's where I would start out. Even before COVID, the US was on a dangerous course vis-a-vis China. The discourse in our country is that it's all China's fault, or that it's a grand competition between two systems. I don't buy that basic model. I don't believe that there is any fundamental reason for conflict, confrontation, deep competition. I do not believe China is out to take over the world. I don't believe, as our foreign policy documents state these days that China is out to undermine American values and American prosperity. All of this confrontational view, in my mind, is make-believe. I'm not saying China is the ideal country, but I do not believe that China is on a path of confrontation or that there is a great battle between systems. I think our system is really messed up in a lot of ways, so I'm not so keen on going out to champion American values. Donald Trump has American values for half the country: racist, white supremacist, anti-democratic, vulgar. So what we say about ourselves is half wrong to begin with. What we say about China, in my view, is wildly distorted. I go to China several times a year and have done so for 40 years, and I don't recognize in our words what I see and know about China. So my basic plea would be that we get off the rhetoric of the great confrontation. This is the rhetoric that President Biden used in his talk to the Munich Security Conference last week, that this is the great test between systems. This is the talk that each of the new appointees has used, Secretary Blinken and everyone else, in testifying that we are facing profound competition, an ominous threat, a deep competition between systems. Just to put it on the table, I don't believe any of it. China is an evolving country. It is not a rock solid, unchanging society. It's probably changed more than any society on the planet, perhaps, in the last 40 years, and generally in a good direction. Knowing what it was like when I first visited China in 1981 till today, it's unimaginably better and different. And better for us and better for China, I should say. So I would just like to query the basic notion that we are on a path of confrontation, conflict, struggle between systems. China's got a lot to change and improve. So do we in the United States. We're pretty rickety. We just lost 500,000 lives through psychopathy at the top and incompetence throughout our society. China has lost perhaps 5,000 people during this period. So 1/100th of the US for a population 4 times larger, meaning that we are roughly 400 times the mortality rate. So we have a lot to address inside the US. And I think that it behooves us to try to find cooperation with China. The Uyghurs, yes, definitely. And so too, I can give you a list of American crimes against humanity, which is quite long, both domestic and international. So the idea that we're fighting some uniquely fiendish power when it comes to human rights, I also don't buy. They've got serious problems. We've got very serious problems. We start wars. We lock up a lot of people. We have unilateral sanctions against civilian populations in many parts of the world designed to create mass hunger and unrest. So even on these, directed topics, which I'm talked to about every day, I'm happy to take them up. I mean, I would be happy for the US to take them up in a context where we acknowledge our deep, flawed human rights as well, because both countries and many other parts of the world need to do vastly better on human rights than we are doing. What has COVID done? COVID has probably accelerated all of the trends that were already underway. COVID accelerated China's technological narrowing of the gap, I would say. COVID accelerated the moves to digital societies in both countries. And China in general has a more comprehensive strategy on that than the United States for a lot of structural and political reasons. COVID increased the animosity and the distrust. By the way, if it turned out that this is a lab release of a virus, that would have major geopolitical implications. If it turns out, on the contrary, that Trump and Pompeo claim that and it's false, that also has major geopolitical implications. My best guess from what I know is that this was not a lab release, but it's an open question to continue to be researched. But our country claimed that it was. The president said at one point, "I'm about to release the information on that." Pompeo said that till the end. That's geopolitics of a dangerous sort, in my mind. So COVID accelerated many trends that were underway, including the distrust and including the normalization of, oh, I see Bob Jervis. This is all about the security dilemma. Everything. It's all about the security dilemma. We are neurotic in this country, so we're suffering the security dilemma. When China closes a little bit of the gap on anything, we say, see how aggressive they are. So, Bob, this is thanks to you, I understand this. And that's my view of what this is about. So I would like us to find absolutely ways to cool down the rhetoric, to stop insulting China every day, which we're doing by design, to see how tough we can be, which I don't think is helpful, to try to institutionalize a high-level dialogue between the two countries on many issues of concern that are extremely important and of mutual concern, to work on climate change together, to work on stopping COVID together, because both sides have a lot of tools to do that, and that kind of cooperation would be extremely important. And to avoid the kind of mindset that occurred on June 28th, 1914, which is humanity at its dumbest, but where we're completely capable of doing that again. And we're only going to get one more time to do that mistake again in our current reality, so we should avoid it at all costs. So let me just pause there, not to rant onward, but I'd, of course, be happy to address any specifics, but I'm counting on cooperation with China on SDR allocations, on logistics of immunization, on fighting climate change, on COP26, and I'd like to meet with China in the Human Rights Council, where we discuss our shared deep flaws of our societies and what we could do about them. Back to you, Stuart.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. We still have a few minutes left with you, so let's see if anybody, any of our panelists might jump in. I know they still have to do their presents, but if anybody wants to challenge anything Jeff Sachs had to say, I can say, or anyone else, Bob, or there's a couple of Bobs here. Bob Shapiro's here, Karen's here. And
I'm happy to rant on more, but I thought I would stop.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the as you would call a pissing match between whether it was released in a lab and this, kind of, kindergarten style diplomacy on things like that. That also came from China too, who's accusing it of coming in on frozen food. So,
absolutely.
But Jeff, isn't the more important question not really where it began, but in the soft power question, the global leadership question, how did China actually handle it when they knew it was a major outbreak? I mean, that's not just a US thing. I mean, the world looks at China and where this thing, it came from Wuhan. And how did that supposedly highly efficient and country very interested in its place in the world and competing with the US, maybe not in the ways that, might be fiery, but in just normal world politics. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that, let me say that where it came from now does matter a lot for also the reason of avoiding the next pandemic, but also because if it was a lab release and China hid that, that would be devastating. On the same time, if it was not a lab release and we accuse China of deliberately releasing this, as much of the US right has done, that's pretty devastating in my view also. So I think the stakes are not insignificant on this question, even aside from the real issues of preventing further pandemics of this kind. Having said that, we may never know for sure for reasons that everybody understands well, but we may learn a lot as well over the next months and years, as usually happens with zoonotic events. But on the question of how China handled it, I see it almost completely differently from the narrative that we have right now. Based on what I know now, which is pretty careful TikTok analysis from what we understand from the first days of this, the first evidence of the cluster was sometime in December, mid-December probably. WHO was notified on December 31st. The sequence of the new pathogen was posted on January 11. And China locked down on January 23. Unbelievably fast in the recorded history of pandemic zoonotic events. Within a few weeks, the new pathogen was identified and it was sequenced, and smart countries like Korea turned it into effective test kits almost overnight. By the way, Taiwan got it on the night of December 31st. Hell with this, no more air flights. And they understood completely because they understand their neighbor also, and stopped everything. Our CDC got a call from China CDC on January 4th and said, we got a serious problem over here. Tell your president. Okay, now having said that, my view is that in the heat of confusion during Chinese New Year of a completely new pathogen, during a flu season, pneumonia season, and all the rest, there is not anything in that that is extraordinary. Now, it's also true. Local authorities screwed up in some ways. But let me give you a different context of this question. On January 4th, we were notified by the Chinese CDC. On January 23rd, we saw China lock down. On January 30th, WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. So that was January 30th. Our psychopathic president could not get anything into his numbskull head for the next 11 months. And we're wondering why China didn't get it perfect in the first 2 weeks. So I find the whole idea of this early screw up of China weird, actually. They didn't even know it was a new disease then. And we knew it was a crushing new disease in January a year ago, and for one entire year couldn't react in a sane way. Of course, we had a madman as president. This is clear. I mean, mentally disordered. But as a country, we couldn't get it right. So we're still talking about what did China do wrong in the first 3 weeks, not what did we do wrong in the next 12 months. And I don't want to forgive every step that's taken, but in the fog of battle of a new pathogen, the pace of reaction was very strong. It happened, sad to say, that this outbreak took place in the Chinese Lunar New Year, when everybody's traveling and when there's celebrations everywhere and families moving everywhere and local festivities everywhere. That was bad luck, to be sure. But this idea that the first 3 weeks is the test of China's complicity and the next 12 months is incidental, I would regard the next 12 months as showing how hard it is to react, especially, of course, with the psychopathic president. But other than that, that we couldn't react even in a 12-month period should give us pause to overemphasizing the narrative about the first 3 weeks. That's how I see it. And so I've never warmed up to that argument. I've looked at it in detail, day to day, hour to hour, and I just don't get it.
You know, Jeff, I know Savannah's going to be dragging you out of here soon, but two real quick ones. One, I saw a statistic, it's right down Jeff Sachs' alley. The US has vaccinated about 50 million. Britain has vaccinated about 20 million. And there are 130 countries in the world that have yet to have a single vaccination. Now, partly that's a failure of Western leadership, but partly it's also the fact that the West got hit so hard and their populations have the highest death count and infection rates, and their governments are trying to stem the tide. So I understand the U.S. is getting some bad publicity out there for not doing more out in the world, but we recognize it wasn't just Trump and America. I mean, the Europeans, many of them got hit even harder than Trump's America. So these democracies got hit hard, UK, US. And so does it make sense for them to focus on their populations first, or is it more important to be seen as a global, compassionate leader now and into the future?
What's missing till now, and I was working on it all morning actually in some detail, is the lack of a specific plan of action over the next 2 years, basically, for complete global immunization. The fact of the matter is, it's rather amazing that science and biotech and pharma was able to deliver, I would say, around 10 now vaccines that are already of proven efficacy and more to come within a year. So this is an incredible triumph of science. And I think we should, again, just like I said about China by January 11 having posted the pathogen, the real news about the vaccines is, oh my God, within 1 year, we have mass vaccinations underway. It's never happened before, anything remotely like this. But what we don't have is a plan right now that actually addresses the world needs. And there's one basic reason for that, and that is financing. It requires about $50 billion between now and end of 2022 for comprehensive global financing. And the institution we created for this, called ACT Accelerator and COVAX, which is the vaccine part of ACT Accelerator, has raised a few $1 billion, has about a $25 billion financing gap for 2021, and no financing at all raised for 2022. So this is the debacle that we're in, because no one thinks ahead right now, because no one has any money in hand to sign contracts, to make the plans, to scale up the production, and so on. I would put it in the following context. What is $50 billion among friends when you're trying to stop a multi-trillion-dollar pandemic? It's nothing. The US will appropriate 100 times that between March 2020 and March 2021. 2.1 trillion last March, 900 billion December, and 1.9 trillion now. $5 trillion bucks, and we haven't found 50 billion for the world. Now, the US isn't the only one to fund the world. We have the rest of the high-income countries as well. Total borrowing by government according to OECD data released yesterday, has been $18 trillion since the pandemic started. And we don't fund the multilateral effort. This is where the essential craziness comes from. This tiny amount can't get into the bank. So what I'm proposing right now, and it seems like it may be moving forward, is using a new SDR allocation for this purpose. There's going to be an SDR allocation of about $500 billion. And through various financial engineering mechanisms, I'm trying to argue to put 50 billion of that towards a comprehensive program for immunization through the end of 2022. There's little that can be done right now, Stuart, over the next few months because the scale up is basically where it is. The lead times on further scale up are about 6 months minimum, 9 months realistically, just for the vials, the labeling, the shipments, the rest. But we're going to miss 2022 if we don't contract for the scale up now. And that's what we should be focusing all our attention on.
We're going to move on to our other experts, and there's going to be some different viewpoints respectfully portrayed today. That's why.
No, I don't believe that.
That's why we create a panel the way we do. Jeff, by the way, on your way out, I love the way you played off the 1914, the 1991, the 2001, the 2008. But something to think about. I know you love thinking about this too. It wasn't just the overreactions or the poor reactions after these shocks. It was the lack of foresight before they occurred in the public policy and government decision making. And that's something we always have to think of too.
I agree with that, but if the Archduke's car had not turned down the wrong right turn and backed up to Gavril Princip's escapade, God, the world would be different.
But they had the offensive. The ideology of the offensive also. They had these other bureaucratic and military doctrines.
I agree, and I agree completely. I just think what they really show is our madness. And so we should stop confrontations and calm down. That's my basic bottom line.
Easy chance. Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. Sorry that I have to leave, but thank you for letting me join.
Double back and watch the next panelist if you can, and we can chat sometime.
Fantastic. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Okay, and now for something completely different. We are going to go to some of our other panelists. Like I said, we wanted to get a bunch of good opinions here today to shake up our thinking about what's coming in the world. So let's go to Andrew Scobell. He's going to give us a presentation. We can have some dialogue, and Danny will jump in afterwards.
Thanks, Stuart. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. So just to respond very quickly to the bomb thrower who ran out the door. Jeff may be right that that doesn't accurately reflect what's going on. But I think the problem is that the perception in Washington and in Beijing is that the U.S. and China are engaged in intensified great power competition. So that's a challenge, a reality, makes it a reality that we have to grapple with. On the topic of COVID and geopolitics, I think that the question the panel is supposed to be wrestling with, I think, is how has the pandemic and the response to it altered relations amongst great powers? In my view, the major seismic activity event of 2020 has not fundamentally altered geopolitics. I think that's also what Jeff was concluding. Rather, the pandemics reinforced and exacerbated existing fault lines in great power competition. So I think there have been a few additional more fallout that I'll touch upon when I get to the end of my comments. China, of course, is the epicenter of, or ground zero of COVID, or to put it differently, it's the home turf of patient zero. Speaking of zeros, I'm going to zero in on China. China and COVID, in my view, is a tale of two narratives. It's the first is the official Chinese Communist Party narrative, and the second is what I'll call the global public narrative. The official Chinese narrative goes something like this, that under the swift, resolute, and disciplined leadership of the Communist Party, the virus was contained within China and the Chinese people were protected. On the other side, Beijing globally, the narrative is that the Chinese played a key leadership role in combating COVID, and a grateful world recognized this, thereby bolstering China's stature as a responsible great power. Of course, the domestic part of the official Chinese narrative is at odds with the reality of a fumbled initial response, a cover-up, and the persecution of whistleblowers, or in official Chinese communist speak, it's the rumor mongers, such as the late Dr. Li Wenliang of Wuhan. Yet from the vantage point of February 2021, the Communist Party's domestic response to COVID looks extremely effective and highly impressive, especially compared with the botched and incompetent responses of many other great powers, including the United States. Hence, the official narrative is effective, resonates with most Chinese people. Moreover, the counter narrative in the domestic arena is either weak or non-existent. Meanwhile, the global portion of the official Communist Party narrative is vigorously promoted both within China and without. Among the Chinese people, the narrative is largely accepted, whereas the reaction in the outside world to the official Chinese narrative is open to considerable scrutiny because communist propaganda machine doesn't control or even dominate this space. So what's the official narrative on the global struggle against COVID? According to China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, speaking early in January of this year, said that China has contributed to and supported the global response to COVID-19 in many ways. And he argued that it's asserted it's the common enemy of humanity, and it's the shared responsibility of the international community to defeat it. And China has stepped up to the plate and worked hard in global cooperation right from the start with other countries to fight the pandemic. According to the foreign minister, there are 6 elements to China's response to the global. More and more, quote, more and more research suggests. Can you hear me?
You jumped out when you said there were 6.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can, but you froze up after you said.
Okay.
Go back to when you said there were, I believe you said there were 6 something coming up.
Okay. Yep. Sorry. There are 6 elements, according to Foreign Minister Wang, to China's global response to COVID. The first element is that China was the first country to report cases. And he also argues asserts that research suggests that the pandemic was caused by separate outbreaks in multiple places around the world. So trying to make the case that China wasn't the origin, wasn't ground zero for the pandemic. The second element of China's response, according to Wang, is that China took the most rigorous control measures to fight the virus, and in the shortest time possible, China controlled it, and China made an early contribution to building a strong global line of defense against the virus. The third element, according to Wang, was that China was active in engaging online with countries and governments around the world. According to Wang, more than 100 video meetings with experts from other countries. There was China established a online information center to share China's experience and the status of COVID within China. And in short, that according to Wang, China shared its experience with other countries without reservation. The fourth element of China's response, according to Wang, was that China provided urgently needed assistance in launched the largest global emergency humanitarian campaign since 1949. And according to Wang, China provided assistance to more than 150 countries, sent dozens of medical teams to 34 countries, and provided additional funding to WHO. Fifthly, according to Wang, China did its best as the largest manufacturer of medical supplies in the world. Wang asserted that China provided more than 220 billion masks, 2.25 billion protective suits, and over 1 billion testing kits to countries around the world. The sixth element of China's response, according to Wang, was that China was the first country to make the pledge to have vaccines available as a global public good, to help developing countries get access to affordable vaccines and engage in R&D to acquire and disseminate vaccines. So as part of China's official narrative then, Beijing insists that China is an integral part of what its modern propaganda machine describes as a community of shared future for mankind. To those beyond the borders of China, this verbiage mostly rings hollow because China is more focused on rhetorical flourishes, one-off gestures of support, and targeted distributions of key COVID protection items, so-called mask diplomacy, it's more interested in that than it is in the serious and sustained cooperation, or even the sharing of pandemic information with other countries and the WHO. So public praise and expressions of appreciation from WHO officials and from similar pronouncements from leaders of other countries, such as Serbia and Italy, have been widely reported within China. China has also followed up on mask diplomacy with so-called vaccine diplomacy, exporting thousands of doses of, I think it's 3 different vaccines to 15 countries around the world, including Argentina, Mexico, Pakistan, and Turkey, and the UAE. Again, these initiatives were widely publicized within China. In addition, the Communist Party portrays China as the victim of scurrilous gossip, complaining when US officials label COVID as the China virus or the Wuhan virus. And a foreign ministry official even started a rumor tweeting that, quote, it might be the US Army that brought the epidemic to Wuhan. And it should be noted that the World Military Games were held in the Chinese city in October 2019, and more than 9,000 uniformed personnel from more than 100 militaries from across the globe participated in those games. So that's the official Chinese narrative. However, China's own silences directly contradicts its official narrative. At best, Beijing was opaque, slow, misleading, and unhelpful in its global COVID communication and outreach. Officials withheld vital information and data while dispensing inaccurate and misleading information, as well as deflecting blame. What the world witnessed was, to quote an Associated Press investigative report, quote, a pattern of government secrecy and top-down control evident throughout the pandemic, unquote. Chinese doctors and health professionals were ordered not to share data with with colleagues and organizations outside of China, nor to make this data public. So this stonewalling approach allowed COVID to spread beyond China's borders, delaying and inhibiting international efforts to contain it. Of course, China cannot be blamed for the incompetence of other governments, but at the same time, a transparent and timely Chinese approach almost certainly would have saved lives and prompted other governments to take COVID more seriously and enact effective measures sooner. Instead, the Communist Party's approach has increased distrust, exacerbated tension between great powers, and there's produced the lack of an effective collective response to COVID. So to wrap up, three concluding points. First, to reiterate what I said at the outset, COVID has reinforced existing fault lines of great power competition. As Lin Kwok of the IISS observed, quote, that the crisis seemed to have sharpened pre-existing tensions between the US and China rather than radically reshaping geopolitics. It should be noted that Kwok was speaking in particular of the Indo-Pacific, but I think this observation is also applicable to the entire globe. Second concluding point, that COVID has shaken geo-economic linkages and disrupted global supply chains, prompting considerable discussion in the United States and elsewhere of economic and technological decoupling. Third concluding point, COVID has been an unpleasant wake-up call for many countries, for many states, including middle and lesser powers, shattering assumptions that the superpower and/or great powers will step up and lead in times of global crisis. The experience of COVID-19 suggests that great powers, including China, have neither the will nor capacity to protect global public goods or look out beyond their own narrow self-interests, notwithstanding the high-minded rhetoric of foreign ministers quoted earlier. So I'm going to stop there, and so we have plenty of time for questions. Thanks.
That was terrific, Andrew. Thank you. I have a few questions, but I want to go to Danny. She might want to address a few points that Jeff raised, you raised, and then we'll see what kind of dialogue we want to have after, but really raised some really critical points, different than what Jeff raised, but equally challenging for moving forward. Danielle, Pletka.
Stuart Gottlieb, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. Thanks especially to Columbia for having me. I apologize. I'm sitting in a hotel room, and so I hope that my connection will stay good. I've been playing with it for the last hour. So first of all, let me commend Andrew. I thought pretty much everything he said I agreed with. Well, wait, except one thing. You at the beginning you said, quote, Jeff may be right, unquote. So that was the one thing you said that I didn't agree with. I don't think Jeff is right about anything. But I don't want to stab a man in the back when he's not with us. So let's just pretend he didn't say anything that he said. So let's start. And sorry, whenever you bat cleanup, you have rather than giving a whole presentation about a set of ideas, you end up riffing off of what everybody else talks about, which personally I enjoy. I hope our audience shares that, but if not, feel free to abuse me in the Q&A session. So, what I think is most important that Andrew said is not to fall into this trap of the date. 9/11 changed everything. The murder of Archduke Ferdinand changed everything. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Of all of those, I may sign up to the Pearl Harbor idea, but even there, probably not. All of these incidents are cliff notes, spark notes, sheets to help us understand inflection points that were already very much underway. whether it was the bad behavior of the Kaiser or Hitler's intention to invade and divide Poland and then conquer the rest of Europe, or whether it was, if we come back to our own more modern era, the intent of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the Salafi jihadis to eventually attack the United States in ways that they could. So we can cheat if we like, because it helps us to orientate ourselves around a particular moment. But in fact, these things are not the great changes that people suspect. And of course, COVID is exactly the same. Okay. The only thing that I would say, and we've talked a lot about China, my area of expertise is not China, although I've done quite a lot of writing on it in the last couple of years, just because of its importance to not just US foreign policy overall, but also to the part of the world that I care a lot about, which is the Middle East. So let's just talk quickly about how things have accelerated, if you want, have become more of what they were prior to COVID. And that is, that China plays a particular role that I think some would like to believe, Jeff and others, is either reactive or more benign, or perhaps in self-interested in only the most enlightened of ways. And of course, what we learn from COVID is that Xi Jinping's China was headed in a very, very different direction. That was already evident long before the outbreak of COVID-19. What was evident was that China was moving away from the economic opening that was transformative for the People's Republic towards a statist model that is going to be ultimately devastating. I believe, my colleagues at AEI believe, devastating for the People's Republic. We see already the straws in the wind of this, whether it is simply labor force participation, it is obviously the aging of the country, it is the inability of the central government to manage its increasingly fractious provinces, and it is an economic decline, lack of innovation. We could keep on going here. Those things are at this point baked in the cake for China, and it's very unlikely, certainly according to my, the three people who I look to most on these issues, Nick Eberstadt, Dan Blumenthal, and Derek Scissors, three of my beloved AEI colleagues who guide me on such things. These things are baked in the cake. What I think COVID helped with was to make an argument by the United States that, frankly, the US had not made very capably, not under Donald Trump, not under his predecessors, which is that we need to be more alive to competition with China, that we need to be more proactive in our competition with China, that China represents a genuine threat in areas that we don't like to think about very proactively. America likes to think of itself as a technology leader when we go out and tell our European friends in 2019, prior to the outbreak of COVID, hey, Huawei is a bad actor. Probably don't want to move on with a 5G infrastructure that allows Huawei to manage all of the back end of your communications, because that has real implications for your future. They look at us correctly and say to us, okay, well, what are you offering us instead? And the United States has positioned itself, let's use a gentle word, inexpertly in this space. The United States has not thought about this kind of competition in a terribly effective or proactive way. And I think COVID, again, sort of woke us up a little bit to this challenge. Similarly, the nerds among us, and I assume that that's probably our entire audience, because otherwise, why the heck would you be with us on a Friday afternoon? The nerds among us had spent time understanding that Chinese policy was a multidimensional one. So that in fact, we were concerned about a Chinese candidate being the head of the World Health Organization, or should we say a Chinese-backed candidate. But it was only when push came to shove that we realize, oh, this has implications for our lives. This has implications for the transparency with which we confront one of the most serious modern challenges, this pandemic, right? And of course, now we are much more alert to that, but it's not simple and straightforward to walk backwards and fight off Chinese predations in the International Labor Organization, the World Health Organization, ICAO, all of these organizations that most of us prefer never to think about, these United Nations specialized agencies. So again, in all of these areas, and most importantly, and I think Andrew talked about this as well, and most importantly in the area of economics, we have woken up a little bit to what the Xi Jinping Communist Party is about in ways that we were less alive to, or at least more broadly less alive to prior to COVID. And again, the expression that I think we use very effectively about this is, we say that China was brought into the global community, whatever we want to call it. I have no idea what the politically correct expression is for the international order, in order that the rules of the road would at once bring China in, but also constrain it to behave the way that the rest of the civilized trading world behaved. And instead, China has taken those rules and bent them to its own advantage, and did so over a period of years without any substantial pushback. And so here is another place where I would say that COVID and Donald Trump, and please take as given all of the usual appropriate condemnations of Donald Trump and what a dreadful president he was and what a terrible human being he is, and but that in fact we had not had a national conversation about China's role prior to Donald Trump, and that COVID in some ways helped to underscore why that conversation was very much worth having. If you want to take it apart from Donald Trump, I urge you only to look at my native country of Australia and ask yourself why it is that a country of 1.4 billion people, right, would be treating my country of 24, 25 million people with the aggression that China has displayed since Australia dared to stand up to the Chinese in the international community. A sustained campaign of intimidation, aggression, sanctions, and an effort to genuinely harm Australian businesses, and Australia's standing in the world. A strong, good, positive country that is just misunderstood does not behave that way. A strong, good, positive country that is misunderstood does not take two Canadian hostages, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and take them and hold them in prison, okay, for no reason other than to use them as bargaining chips with the United States and Canada. This is Iranian behavior. This is not the behavior of a misunderstood global power with which we are having a competition that we are losing, and somehow we are lashing out. Obviously, the Uyghurs have their place in this, and again, everybody knows what's going on there. This is a horror. Every single one of us who say never again should look ourselves in the mirror and say, well, actually, again, but this time really we're just paying less attention. So in all of these instances, COVID has kind of underscored the problem, but it has also underscored a set of other problems. And I don't want to blab on for too long, because I want to give everybody an opportunity to chat. But let me just throw a couple of things out there that have been, if we want to say it this way, laid bare over the last year. One that Andrew alluded to and Jeff alluded to in some ways, which is that countries behave in their own self-interest. Now, obviously, those of us who studied this know that most countries behave in their own self-interest, but it has been fascinating to watch the European Union behave in its own self-interest. When it comes to, oh, do you need PPE? I'm very sorry, Germany says, we're going to keep that PPE for ourselves. Oh, vaccines? No. That's going to be for us first, and then you guys can have it. And this is, this is of course behavior that many of us expect, but at the same time, absolutely lays bare the falseness of some of these 20th century constructs of alliances and partnerships and communities. We're a community sometimes, but when push comes to shove, we're really just a sovereign country. And for those of us who've been paying attention to this, the behavior of some of these sovereign countries has been nothing short of shocking. Now, what has not gotten a mention here? As we've turned inward because of COVID, again, only accelerating a trend that we saw long before. Right? You wonder how it is that someone like Donald Trump got elected. Donald Trump is a symptom of a trend that was already well in place. This desire to pull out of trading arrangements, for example. Don't forget, in 2016, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump opposed the United States being part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trading arrangement. So, and we can go on and on about the views that were shared. This is a trend that existed already, but because of it, because of this inward turn, because of our unwillingness to grapple with problems at their inception, we are still confronting challenges like North Korea. We are confronting an Iranian nuclear weapons program that many countries don't wish to expend a great deal of capital, political capital, solving. Similarly, and again, something that barely gets a mention in the papers because we're too busy talking about Ted Cruz and his vacation in Cancun, is the spread of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the return to, I would say, a strength that is much greater than that just prior to 9/11 across much of Africa. But this inward turn means that we are not going to be willing to contend with these until they come back, and if I may use a political science term, bite us in the ass. And so here, Andrew, you're right in the middle of my screen. So every time I say something naughty, I can see your face and it makes me laugh. In any case, all of these are straws that were blowing around long before COVID, but that COVID has made much harder to deal with. The only last bit of this that I would say is, at least perhaps it will afford us the opportunity to be a little bit more honest about the challenges that we face. Yes, China is bad for your health, actually. Yes, we are selfish in how we deal with our national challenges. And yes, the countries are headed in directions that are troubling to all of us who believe in what is quaintly still called liberal internationalism by some of us. I'm going to stop there, Stuart. All right, everybody, you can yell at me and Andrew, ask us questions, and just underscore to us all how wrong Jeff was about pretty much everything.
That was vintage Danielle Pletka. That's why she's here. Excellent ways to frame some of the aspects of this. And by the way, when you're on Zoom, when they're on mute, you don't hear them yelling as much as you usually do when they're in person. But we'll give them a chance. We were going to wrap at 1:15, but we're going to go a little further. We can go to 1:30. So let's see if I want to give Andrew a chance to, because they've been playing off each other a little bit. Andrew, a chance to dialogue with Danny if you have any points, and then I might have a question for you.
Why don't you go ahead, Stuart? Okay. Go ahead.
The question of the ideological competition, and by the way, this panel is about geopolitics. So we're looking at the great powers. That's why I have China experts, US experts, and some global experts to give some context. By the way, stay tuned. We might have a third panel on the way the COVID pandemic is impacting the poorest nations of the world. So that might come up in the fall. just to go back to Jeff Sachs, and I know he's not here, so I'm not going to go beyond what he said, but this idea that there's not an ideological competition going on, and Jeff, Andrew, I'm going to come to you first, and then Danny. This idea there's not an ideological competition, you know who disagrees with that? Xi Jinping disagrees with that. He is not shy about the statements. And even if we say that that's just for domestic consumption, which is understandable in world politics, the outward signs, the foreign policy itself, is aligned with this idea of seeing it as an ideological competition, that they believe that they can win, and they think the U.S. is, hamstrung from 9/11 and the financial crisis and different things. Again, I see democracies a little bit more positively than Jeff Sachs does. Right now, I think democracies can revitalize and renew themselves in ways that one-party states can't. So I think they take on this competition at their own peril. There are other ideologies that took on Western democracies when they were also looking pretty flimsy in like the 1930s, and found out that democracies have a way of revitalizing themselves. Sometimes they need a shake-up in order to do it. But what's interesting, Andrew, is things that Xi Jinping has said. For example, as China grows and becomes a global great power, he is advancing this idea, as you pointed out, he referred to it also as a community of common destiny in the world. That's not, that's the China dream he's talking about. His community of common destiny is about the China vision of the world. The China dream thing is obviously a hit on the classic American dream. He's juxtaposing this dream versus dream, and one is surpassing the other. So in the rhetoric and in the actions, and again, this is not unusual in world affairs. Countries compete for power. It's an anarchic system. These countries will try to gain leverage as best they can. U.S. does it, China does it, everyone does it. It's not unique to China. We just happen to be in a emerging kind of more bipolar type system. And when it comes to global organizations, I want to get back to global leadership for a second. There was a really good question, a good chat question by Pavlo, who asked, are we actually entering a G0 world? Where there's no real global leadership. The U.S. and China are so focused on each other and this ideological competition. Andrew, you finished your talk with this point, that they're so in this competition that's been exacerbated by COVID. And Pavlo asked, are we entering this G0 world without any global leadership? And how do this panel is not about global organizations, but it's relevant because the great powers, are going to determine this stuff. Xi Jinping said the new goal of the China dream and the community of common destiny is that China will be an active part in reforming and developing the global governance system. So he's clearly looking at sort of the Western institutions created after World War II and thinking about a new China model and this global governance system based on more of a China ideology. And that's not, based on Thomas Paine, that type of global governance system, I wouldn't think. But Andrew, why don't you tell me what you think?
Oh, that piece of cake, I'll do that in about 30 seconds. Now, on the issue of global governance, the question of global governance, yes, China is thinking big and it's not happy with the way things are now because its fundamental argument is that it wasn't present at the creation. It didn't make the rules. But it should have the right to change those rules or adapt those rules. But that said, I don't think I haven't seen any clear articulation of what China wants as a new world order, so to speak, what that new order should look like. So I would call China's a dissatisfied power, but they're not really sure. They're not a revisionist power. They're not really sure. They want to change things, but they're not exactly sure what precisely they want to change and what they want to produce. When you mentioned going back to ideological competition, I think you're exactly right. Chinese believe that. I think what's different to the situation several decades ago when the Chinese Communist Party was run by true believers who wanted to export global revolution and create communist, a global communist movement. Today, they don't want to do that. they're not offensive minded in that as far as ideology is concerned. They're actually very defensive and very insecure, and so what Xi Jinping's doing is pushing this idea. He doesn't call it a China model, but this alternative pushback to Western liberal or bourgeois democracy and human rights. He's pushing back because he feels, and the Communist Party, his Communist Party colleagues feel insecure. They feel under threat. So it's from a position of weakness and vulnerability. That said, he's pushing it this idea as alternative to sort of justify authoritarian regimes around the world. But the moment, I'll close by saying that the moment Xi Jinping says, there are universal human rights and universal values, he thinks he's signing the death warrant of the Chinese Communist Party, because the whole argument is not that China is opposed to democracy, but you need a democracy that's suited to Chinese conditions, and there are Chinese values. And Chinese people believe in human rights too, but they're not the same as Western values. I'll stop.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to call an audible. Bob Jervis has his hand up, and then we're going to go to Craig is our next question, and after Bob.
Thank you. Very good and interesting presentations. I have two fairly specific questions, really, I think mostly for Andrew. One first deals with China's early response to the COVID. The story, at least from the New York Times and others, is that some of the problem was that the local authorities did not rapidly inform the national ones, and especially because they wanted the big feast for, I guess, one of the holidays. So to what extent was the problems early on related to center periphery, lack of communication or frictions? Second question, looking forward on the inoculation of the world, to what extent does China have the capability and the desire to be a major contributor, not, on the sporadic to make the papers, but really a major contributor to vaccines in the third world? Thanks.
Stuart, do you want me to reply right away? Okay. So to your first question, Bob, the China's COVID response. Again, I don't claim to know the full the inside scoop, but from what I've been able to piece together, the pretty early on, relatively early on in the crisis, in the pandemic, in late December or very early January, it became clear to local officials that they had a serious frickin' problem. And so they quickly pushed it up the food chain. But the response that they got was top down slam. Don't, put the lid on this, don't spread panic. And so that's, it was, nobody likes to bring bad news, send bad news up. But I think it was more the top-down control, suppress information, don't spread panic. That was the problem. As far as does China, the second question, does China have the capability to do vaccinations around the world? I'm not sure. I think they do, but my question, and I don't know the answer to it, is how effective are their vaccines? Because they didn't do the testing that the US and the Europeans did. So I think that's the question mark. How effective are their vaccines and how safe are they? Thanks.
Bob, did you have a second question, Bob? No. Craig, I don't believe your last name is iPhone, so we'll just call you Craig.
Thanks. No, I'm Craig Charney of Charney Research.
Oh, hi, Craig.
Hi. I'm afraid my son changed that to Craig and Ari, and then Craig's iPhone the last time we were on a Zoom together. Anyway, look, this is a fascinating discussion, but some of it seemed a little off balance to me. On the one hand, it's clear that China screwed up massively the initial response and was responsible both for an outbreak at home and overseas, and have failed to acknowledge that. On the other hand, they've also done a tremendous amount in terms of sending vaccines, PPE, etc., for self-interested reasons, yes, but that's had an impact abroad and an impact on opinion abroad too. That's particularly been the case when the United States was both enmeshed in denial domestically and incredibly ungenerous internationally, as we were seen as trying to grab everything for ourselves and providing very little. It's been the opposite, for example, of the goodwill that President Bush reaped by establishing PEPFAR. And the net effect of this seems to me to have been that China has been a net gainer. Certainly, I'm a pollster, and what I saw in the final months of 2020 is that the US had record lows in terms of favorability as a combination of COVID, Trump, and racism. And it seems to me that, so I guess my question would be, first, if you compare China and the US in our responses, wouldn't you say that China has been a net gainer? And second, it seems to me that all of the discussion so far has very much stressed the degree of international competition. What about the need for cooperation with China? In the era of the competition with the Soviet Union, arms control was the main area. Now there are at least two others where we're going to need to cooperate, namely global warming, and now we see quite clearly global health. To what extent does China's own self-interest mean that we also have to be prepared to respond, even as we're prepared for their cheating? So those are two broad questions.
Those are excellent questions, Craig. Danny, do you want a response? I know I'm going to go to Andrew. He's going to respond. Danny, do you want to jump in on this one first?
Well, I guess without sucking up any oxygen from Andrew, who I think knows a lot more about the China side of this than I do, I would only say that I think that these polls about American popularity are very misleading. Again, we look at them and we see, first of all, yes, foreigners, particularly our allies, didn't like Donald Trump. But what does that tell us about what America's place in the world is? Are they going to stop hoping to immigrate to the United States? Are they going to stop selling products to the United States? Would we have bought more goodwill by sending more masks around? I honestly think those are extraneous matters, and I would argue that you are actually not right, that China's popularity, if we can call it that, has declined substantially. That the Belt and Road Initiative has in some ways become the fake that a lot of us realized it was. Not to everybody, but certainly to many who understand what debt trap diplomacy looks like and understand what it is that the Chinese are all about. So I think that an argument that China has come out of COVID better off, or even relatively better off than the United States, is very difficult to sustain. Andrew, again, you know a lot more about this than I do.
Thanks, Danny. So yeah, Andrew, if you could take that away.
Yeah. I think China's gains have been have been fleeting, because it's not just to go back to the sort of a theme here that it's not just COVID that's created tensions. There were pre-existing conditions, and so the combination has led countries around the world to see China China as less of a partner and an opportunity. And the U.S., as Craig was pointing out, and Danielle has pointed out that under Trump has not covered itself in glory, and actually U.S. credit standing in the world has gone down. But I think that's temporary. So what the U.S. did was, in a sense, under Trump, abrogate leadership, including on countering COVID. And so there was a great opportunity for China to fill that vacuum. China talked the talk, and it makes some significant and symbolic gestures to help with the global fight against COVID, but it is not able to follow through. And so that's thankfully from a U.S. perspective. So we have to do, repair the damage, or the Biden administration has to do that. And I think it is starting to do that. But it's not just China's COVID response. It's these other challenges and other things that China's doing very, very assertively and aggressively around the world that contribute to this. As far as the question of cooperation between the U.S. and China, absolutely. I think Chinese are nothing if they are not very pragmatic, so they want to cooperate. And if you look at at least my understanding of the literature that I've toyed with on rivalries, it doesn't mean that rivals cannot cooperate. And so there's plenty of room for cooperation, and both in Washington and Beijing, they may think the two countries are engaged in heightened great power competition. That doesn't mean they want war. That doesn't mean they're planning necessarily preparing to go to war. On the contrary, they still want to cooperate where it's in their mutual interests. But it is challenging to make that cooperation, to actually have cooperation, because of the level of distrust which this whole nastiness and tensions over COVID has exacerbated. So it doesn't make cooperation impossible. It just makes it more challenging.
Craig, do you want to jump back in?
No, I thought those were thoughtful responses. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
But I think following up on Danielle's comments, actually we'll take a look at some of the material on this, because it may be worth pulling together some analysis of this. So thank you for that provocation.
Alex, you're up.
Hi, yes. My question's kind of a simple one, but I wanted to ask about the kind of current world dynamics. I know there's kind of a debate about whether or not the current world dynamics between China and the US are consistent with a unipolar kind of trend. Hello?
Alex, you cut out. You gotta ask again. Okay.
Video, Alex?
Video?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, there you are. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about whether or not, because I know that in the current world dynamics, there's a great debate about whether or not the dynamics between China and the US are consistent with a unipolar transition of power, which is characterized by uncertainty and conflict, or the emergence of a bipolar system, which is more characterized by stability and cooperation, and whether or not COVID has impacted the chances of the emergence of a bipolar system or more cooperation-based systems.
I'm going to turn that over to Andrew if he wants to answer that, but I just want to point out that a bipolar system was stable because there were nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and that's what led to the stability. It took a while for the US and the Soviets to get stable, but it's a very good question, Andrew, as we see the flux in the system, and I think you well represented the argument that China has a long road to go before it can get a legitimacy to become the global superpower. And I think there's, like I said, Mark Twain, the predictions of America's decline. The US economy is still 1/3 larger than China's economy. After all of this, predictions about, China surpassing the United States. U.S. is still at about 21.5 trillion. China's about 14 and change trillion, even though it has 5 times the population. So it seems like, Andrew, what do you think? Are we heading toward one of these great power transition moments, or heading more towards a bipolar system? What are your thoughts on that?
That's good. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think we are in a, I subscribe to the Michael Beckley approach. Mike Beckley's thinking about this, that, the U.S. is still likely to be #1 for a while. And flip that around, and is the alternative a bipolar system? I'm not so sure for 2 reasons. One is, I just lead authored a RAND report last year on China's grand strategy, where we look out to 2050 and speculate about the futures and argue that the most likely future is not a wildly successful China. The Communist Party is not going to be successful in achieving all its grand strategic objectives. It's likely to muddle through on some things, be successful on others. So that tees up, to my mind, because the possibility that other powers will be rising too. And so when we think about China's not the only success story or rising power in Asia, India comes to mind very quickly. So there are other rising powers. So the alternative to a unipolar world might be a multipolar one. Thank you.
Thanks. That's an excellent question, Alex. One of the big ponderables for the next generation or two, actually. Danny, you want to wrap us up? We have about a minute left.
Sure. I'd be happy to wrap us up. So I probably shouldn't say this when I'm talking to a university crowd, and since I got my master's degree in international relations, but I do find these constructs sort of unhelpful. Bipolar, multipolar. I did an interview just 2 days ago with a scholar who, by the way, like Michael Beckley, is a Jeane Kirkpatrick fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a man named Wang Jiwei. And we were talking about, he was imprisoned for 40 months in Iran, and we talked about the role that Iran plays. One of the favorite things that people like to say when criticizing U.S. policy or lack thereof towards Iran is that they like to say, well, Iran isn't the Soviet Union. I mean, really, they're not 10 feet tall. And Jiwei used an expression in talking about this yesterday that I liked a lot. He said, you can spend millions and millions and millions of dollars building a house, and it doesn't really cost an arsonist anything to burn it down. And I think that's a much easier way to think about a lot of these things. Yes, I agree with Andrew about where the United States stands and about China's ambitions. We can talk about Russia as well, but at the end of the day, we also have a lot of arsonists around the world, and there is a proliferating number of them. It's not just Iran. It's not just North Korea. I would actually put Russia a little bit into that category as well. They're not the great power that they think they are, but there are a lot of bad guy irritants that can cause very, very substantial conflict, and we don't have a handle on those at all. So what I would argue is that it's much less about bipolar, multipolar, unipolar, and much more about the fact that there isn't really any collective understanding about who those arsonists are, what the threat is that they represent, or anything else. The last piece of this that I would underscore, and I wrote about this in the 50th anniversary issue of Foreign Policy. We've been talking about all of these changes over time. Is that this desire to look for ideological competition obscures the fact that we've never really faced up to non-ideological competitors. I'd be very interested offline to hear what Andrew thinks about this, but I would say that China is in many ways much more nationalist than it is. It's not really seeking to export communist ideals in the way that the Soviets were. Sure, you know, questioning democracy, destabilizing ideals, that's great. But, you know, undermining our ideals, that's also great. But they are really a rich, disruptive, revisionist power in a way that we have not, in the way that we have not confronted one before. And I think that is a whole new ballgame for a lot of us, and something very much worth thinking about that doesn't fit into all of the IR constructs that all of us learned about in grad school. And with that final slap at our education system, I'm done, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you. We're a little over time. Juan sent a chat message. It's a little late for a formal response, but if people want to stick around, and it's a really sharp point that Juan made in the chat room, people can check it out and respond if you want. We'll keep it open a little bit. But we have to end. Unfortunately, this was really amazing. Our panelists were superb. Jeff Sachs was terrific to kick it off, and we had a great discussion the rest of the way. And thanks for the participation of the audience. Thanks to Ingrid, Ray, the other Saltzman staff, always doing a professional, amazing job. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.